Hello, everyone. Good evening. What a nice turnout. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. So, on behalf of the owners and of the staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to your favorite bookstore for this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose hosts hundreds of in person events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes, some of which are now being held at our branch locations, which have relocated at Union Market and The Wharf. So please look at our website for a full list. Housekeeping before we start. Please turn off or silence your cell phone so as not to disturb the event. For the Q&A, we ask that you please step up to the microphone over here by the pillar before asking your questions so we can not only hear and enjoy the conversation but to also ensure that it is recorded. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them out front by the registers. We will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so if you'd like to get your book signed, once again, line up by the pillar over here. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So I am honored to introduce Paul Hendrickson to all of you. Paul is a three-time finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and a winner in 2003 for his book Sons of Mississippi. Another book, The Living and the Dead, Robert McNamara and Five Lives of a Lost War, was a 1996 finalist for the National Book Award. He has been the recipient of writing fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Lyndhurst Foundation, and the Alicia Patterson Foundation. Since 1998, he has been on the faculty of the Creative Writing Program at the University of Pennsylvania, and for 2 decades before that, he was a staff writer at the Washington Post. So tonight, he will be talking about his new book, Fighting the Night, Iwo Jima, World War II, and a Flyer's Life. In this incredible and vivid historical tale of war and family, Paul writes about his father, a fighter pilot that fought in Iwo Jima during the Second World War, and about his mother, who waited for the return of her husband in Ohio. Kirkus Reviews wrote that Fighting the Night is a detailed, vivid narrative which benefits from intensive archival research and exhaustive interviews, an expert account of a father's World War II experiences that gives his fellow airmen equal attention. Paul will be in conversation with David Maraniss. David is an associate editor at the Washington Post and a distinguished visiting professor at Vanderbilt University. He has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for journalism and was a finalist 3 other times. Among his best-selling books are biographies of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Roberto Clemente, and Vincent Lombardi. Everyone, let us all welcome Paul Hendrickson and David Maraniss.
Hello. Can you hear me? This is an awesome crowd, great buzz here, Paul. It's like partly a Washington Post reunion, a family reunion, friends, even one come down from Philadelphia. So very excited about this.
Thank you, and David will go any direction he wants to go, and I'll try to make half-intelligent answers. The only thing I requested was here at the beginning that I introduce you to 2 extremely important people in my life. This is a 4-generation book. My dad, myself, my 2 sons, who are here tonight with their families, their spouses, and the 4th generation, my 2 grandsons, Jackson and Teddy, 8 and 4. And I am going to invite them to come to the front of the room for just a minute. Jackson. So this is Jackson, and this is Teddy. Jackson and I are kind of in the business of doing books together. We have a little parrot series going. A little parrot goes to the pumpkin patch. Maybe after this it'll be Little Parrot Goes to Politics and Prose. Jackson, welcome. And Teddy, 4 years old. Teddy Papa Joe's airplane. What was the name of Papa Joe's airplane?
The Rita B.
The Rita B, and there it is. Can we give a big round of applause for my two grandsons? Fighting the Night is dedicated to them, to my grandsons. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, if the conversation lags, we'll call them back up here.
Yeah.
I'll ask them a few questions. Paul and I have been doing this one way or another. Either one's the author and the other's the interviewer, or the other's the interviewer and the other's the author, many times over the years now. And it so happens that we started at the Washington Post in the very same year, 1977. We got our 20-year pins together.
I remember.
And then Paul left for other things and teaching at Penn, where he's a wonderful professor. And we reconnected there when he invited me up there to talk about 20 years ago. And it's been a great relationship ever since. As anybody knows who's read Paul either back at the Washington Post or in his books, he has an inimitable writing style that nobody should try to copy, but that is wonderful, and that I've never tried to copy, but I've learned so much from reading Paul over the years, and especially sort of his boundless curiosity and willingness to take the story anywhere he wants that interests him, which is what I love about it, because it's always invariably interesting. Fighting the Night is his 8th book, and what struck me first about it is that in some ways, Paul, I saw it a little bit as a bookend to your first book. Not that this will be your last, but all of Paul's books, he's in them. You can feel his sensibility. He introduces himself at various points as the thinker in the book. But this book, like the first one, Seminary, it's really about him and his family and his life. And so I think it's the most personal that I've read of your books. I wanted to start sort of there. When I was writing my book on my father and the Red Scare, as I started the research, I sort of felt, well, this book has been there all along. Even though I hadn't really thought about it much over the years, as soon as I started, it was like, this is the book that I've been waiting to write. And I noticed that at the end of your book, you talk about this book sort of simmering in your eyes for 50 years before you wrote it. One of the things that I encountered was that so many things were there waiting for me that I didn't even realize until I started looking. I'm curious about how you approached this book and whether it had that same impact to you as you started the research.
I will try to do a little justice to that question, but in the same way that I write books, I have to take the quickest tangent detour. I have to say something about David.
Oh, no.
We're in danger of being a mutual admiration society. We won't let that happen. But the fact is, everything he said is so spot on. We did start at the Washington Post, right, at the same time. We got our 20-year pins in the same room, pinned on by Donald Graham. David whispered to me, "What are we doing here?"
But I stayed.
Yes, and David stayed. But in a funny way, we reconnected after I left the Washington Post in a deeper way. And I've long stopped taking this personally, but I like to think that David and I write books on a ratio of 2 to 1. He writes 2, I write 1. He has doubled me up. He's somewhere in the 14 or 15s. And how he does that is something I don't think I'll ever hope to get to the bottom of. He just mentioned this beautiful book that he wrote, a reported memoir about his family called A Good American Family, when his family, his father, a newsman, got caught up in the terrible period of the 50s in the McCarthy witch hunts. And that is a book modeled for me. To specifically go to the question David just asked, that is acute, because one of the things people were saying to me is, should you even try this book at this lady? Won't you get blocked? You've got all these any father-son story is just full of conflicts, and won't it grind you down? I think the fact that the book was kind of simmering, as David said, on the back of my eyeball for half a century, when I actually started, I encountered far less trouble than I expected. My previous book was published 5 years ago. For me, it's an overland speed record to have this book this fast. So yes, David, I think a lot was there. It was always mutating. It was always gestating, always changing forms, but it was existing somehow in my walking dreams, so that when I actually got down to doing it, and it is a reported memoir. One other thing I'll say quickly is David was spot on when he said it's kind of bookended. The first book published in 1983, so that's 41 years ago, is called Seminary: A Search. It's a reported memoir. And this book is a reported memoir. I had to kind of go out and discover the truths in my own heart, and yet so many of those truths were lodged inside of me. When my fingers found the keyboard, the words began to come out. Not without the daily sweat and agony and trouble, but I encountered far less trouble than I thought I would.
And not just in the writing, but also in the research. You know, I didn't, for instance, I didn't know my father had these letters from World War II until I needed them, and then they were there. You didn't know that your father had recorded an oral history, right?
And my kid brother, of 5 children in the family, and 3 are living, my younger brother, 14 years younger, is the only aviator in the family. I'm the supposed researcher. So in the middle of this book, he said, "Paul, guess what? I was just nosing around on the internet. I found this hour-long oral history that Dad did with the Wisconsin Historical Society." That floored me. It never even occurred to my pea brain to think that my father might have sat down with a historian. And to this day, I don't know the circumstances of the why and the how, but he recorded this about 10 months before he died at our family cabin in far northern Wisconsin, and told none of us about it. But the fact that it is now archived at the Wisconsin Historical Society, which is a major repository in America — David is a Wisconsin native and knows all about that — that was like lost treasure of the Incas, because I have one scratchy old cassette tape of my dad talking to hear his voice. But then to find this oral history, an hour long, it's goosebumping, and it exists.
Paul, one of the things I love about your books is the way you use photographs, not just an insert of photographs, but that each photograph allows you to deepen the story. Of course, Sons of Mississippi is essentially based on a photograph of some horrible racist taunting, which unfortunately we saw again a couple of days ago in Mississippi. But this book, each of the photographs that you present deepens the story and presents a different part of the story, the way you analyze it. And let's start with that first one, which you said when you saw it flattened you, the one of your dad and his siblings in Kentucky. And take us through the sort
Because
of the Kentucky
there
part of
are
it.
so few photographs of my father, which seems... So he grew up on a sharecropper's farm in Kentucky in the 1930s, and they weren't taking pictures of themselves on the farm. They were working from dawn to dusk. But I found this photograph of my father holding the bridle of a horse with one of his brothers in the saddle. And then another picture that my Aunt Margina had found for me of when there were 9 children in this sharecropping family. And at this point, 7 were born. And a dirt poor Kentucky family, mother and father, still had the wherewithal to take their children into a photo parlor in town and get them to pose for a photograph. And I showed this photograph to my Uncle Lonnie, who was 90 and the youngest son and the last one alive. And I said, "Uncle Lonnie, where would they have gotten these clothes?" Because they were wearing ties and shirts. and Uncle Lonnie said, I think the funeral, the photo parlor would have furnished the clothes. Of course, they went in their ragamuffins and they went and put on the rental clothes for the photo parlor. Yeah, walking back into a photograph, I can't explain what that does for me exactly. There are several alums from the University of Pennsylvania who are here tonight. I'm so thrilled. Jess Goldstein, a working journalist here in Washington, D.C., she knows all about telling stories out of photographs because she starred in that class. Greg Mom is here. And what we do is we dream ourselves back into the rectangle. We walk back in almost literally as if you're taking a metaphorical step into that photograph. And there are secrets within the four walls of that rectangle if you are willing to really try to go there. And yeah, that's one of the things that does seem to give me some writing strength.
There's another photograph, a beautiful photo of your parents on their wedding day. And, you know, those two wonderful grandchildren of yours and your two great sons wouldn't be here without that. And yet you daringly, under that photo, use a few lines from the poet Sharon Olds.
Yeah. Do you want to? Do you want to?
Yeah.
Sure.
I want to go up to them and say, "Stop! Don't do it. She's the wrong woman. He's the wrong man."
That's a very hard thing from Sharon Olds' poem. You know, one of the things I want to say is that my parents were married for 61 years. And like any family, there were sorrows, there were heartaches. They stayed together. I mean, my father was a boy when he went to war. He was 25 years old. I'm trying to think what I was doing when I was 25 years old. So flying around in the Pacific dark at 25, and my mother was a teenager. When they got married, she was 19 by 8 days. And when he went off to war, she had two babies on her hip, one of whom was me. There's a whole other book to be written about my mother's efforts and struggles in this war, like every mother in that war. She waited out the war in Xenia, Ohio, little farm town, not knowing if she would ever see her husband again. But he came back, and I'm glad to say that the five of us grew up, and that I was able to have my first son with my beautiful wife, Seal, and he is the father of our two grandchildren. And sitting here in the front row is the third generation, John Hendrickson, staff writer for The Atlantic. He knew Papa Joe. All of it seemed, I was telling David in the green room, there are many miracles here, and here's just one. This book is being officially published tomorrow, May 7th, 2024. That's the 21st anniversary of my father's death. He died on May 7th, 2003. The editorial people didn't pick that date. The marketers picked it, and they certainly didn't read the book. They picked it. They picked it as some kind of lead into Father's Day. So when I found out 9 months ago it was being published on May 7th, I was like a man knocking his head, trying to shake the water out of his ears, the waters of gratitude and disbelief.
The geographic center of the book, or of the action of the book, is Iwo Jima in World War II. There's so many touches of grace and fate in that part of the story, including the layout of the base there and your father's survival. But tell us a little bit about that experience he had in Iwo.
So my father was in a squadron called the 549th Night Fighter Squadron. And there were 15 planes, between 15 and 17 planes always. It was a P-61 Black Widow, which was a specialized aircraft that came in at the end of the war. And it had this radar detection, high state-of-the-art equipment sealed in its nose. It was like a tight orchestra of violence, this airplane, because it had these rotating machine guns on top. It carried 500-pound bombs. It had rockets. It had 20 caliber not rockets. The machine guns were on top. 20. At any rate, it was like a. I'm just having a senior moment. It was like a.
You're allowed.
It was like a small, tight orchestra of violence. 20 millimeter cannons. Excuse me. I knew I would get it. 50 millimeter machine guns, 20 millimeter cannons, 500-pound bombs under the wings. It was like a little tight orchestra of violence. He landed on Iwo Jima 3 weeks after the Marines raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, arguably the most famous photograph of World War II, and I see nodding heads. I know you know the photograph I'm talking about. The island was supposedly secure. So many Marines had died taking this little sulfurous scrap of iconic sand. So my father lands with his convoy of widows 3 weeks after the Marines have raised the flag. The island is supposedly secure. Not true. 6 days after he was there, the Japanese, who were hidden in bunkers and caves, staged a last-ditch suicide attack. It was called a kirikomi, not a banzai. It was strategically planned. They wanted to destroy the flyers, not the enlisted men, but somehow they went for the enlisted men's tents. My father's row of tents was about 30 yards from the enlisted man's tents. I mean, this was in the middle of the night, and the tents were being slashed open with sabers, and grenades were being rolled in. My father didn't die that night. And I say in the book that it seems to me, because all the casualties were on the other side, just 30 yards away, that the difference between my father being able to live 6 days after he was on Iwo Jima, I mean, this is, he'd already flown a couple nighttime missions. This was on the ground. He was sleeping in his tent at 4 a.m. And the difference between his being allowed to live and to die, fate somehow saw to it, was a distance of about 30 yards. And if you pull back from that and think about it, that's why I'm here tonight. That's why my sons are here tonight. And that's why the two people, the two young Americans who mean everything to me, to whom the book is dedicated, that's why they're here tonight. So all of it is a miracle of some sort.
War obviously is awful, but you write about the P-61 with what seems to me enormous pleasure, almost sort of absorbing your father's affection for airplanes into yourself. Do you feel that?
Yeah, there was something mythic about this airplane. First of all, it was glossy black, and it took its name from the poisonous spider. Some of the pilots had a red circle painted on the belly like a black widow spider. My father named his plane the Rita B because my mother's name was Rita Bernadine, so the Rita B. I asked little Teddy what the name of Papa Joe's airplane, and it is the Rita B. This was a very strange airplane. It was not a fighter. It was not a bomber. It was a pursuit ship. It was a combination fighter-bomber. It could get to incredible speeds for what seemed like its bulky weight. And it had this mystique about it. And the pilots had to volunteer to try to become night fighters because this was a new specialized art of flying. And my father volunteered for night fighters. He had to stay stateside longer. And I think this has something to do possibly with saving his life. Again, because he entered the war late. He flew 5.5 months off Iwo Jima from March until August, until VJ Day. And he flew 75 missions, about 175 hours of logged time. If he had gone over earlier in another kind of aircraft, he might not have made it back. One of the reasons, I mean, I just speculate about this, is he was a Kentucky farm boy. He used to sit on wagon tongues in the 1930s and watch crop dusters go over. And he said to himself, I want to fly airplanes. I mean, what kind of a leap through space and time would that have been for a know-nothing Kentucky farm boy who had almost literally never been outside the county where he was born, Union County, Kentucky. His mother, my grandmother, said to him, supposedly, Joe Paul, that was his name. In Kentucky, everybody had two names. He's Joe Paul. And he used to pronounce it like one word, Joe Paul. His mother said, Joe Paul, if you want to commit suicide, why don't you just go out there and jump off the barn? But he enlisted as a serviceman way before the war started. He went through mechanic school. He applied for flight school, and he ended up flying this high-tech warship. And you're right, David, that it does give me goosebumps. There are 4 in existence. One of the things that makes the Black Widow this legendary airplane, there are 4 in existence. One is out here at the Dulles Airport Annex of the Air and Space Museum. One is at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. One is in Beijing at the Beijing Air Museum. And the 4th is an hour from our home in Philadelphia in Reading, Pennsylvania, being restored. And the dream at the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum, the dream is the owner wants to, and they've been working on it for 15 years, is completely restore it, take it out on the runway, fly it up over the cornfields, and there it is, a Black Widow in the sky.
In doing research, inevitably, perceptions of some of the figures in any book change as you do the research. For me, in the book about my father in the Red Scare, it actually was a colleague of ours at the Washington Post, who I greatly admired, who I discovered in getting the FBI files that he'd ratted on my father back at the University of Michigan in the 1930s.
Yes.
Morton Mintz. And for you, I know this is very different, but in some ways has some similarities. It might have been your confrontation with the great writer James Dickey and someone you'd written about before and what you discovered later about his activities with the P-61 or not.
I think a lot of people here would know the name James Dickey. He was a great 20th century poet. He aggrandized himself into the pilot seat of a Black Widow. Actually, he was the radar operator in the back. It was a 3-man ship. There was the pilot, there was a gunner sitting directly above the pilot, and there was the radar operator, the RO, in the back, who played a very, very crucial role. But James Dickey had started out to be a pilot, and he washed out of flight school. So later, after the war, when he becomes this great American poet, who also wrote the novel Deliverance, do you remember? And the famous movie, The Deliverance, with Burt Reynolds and others. Dickey wrote an immortal poem about the Black Widow called The Firebombing. In 1976, which was the year before I joined the Washington Post, I was working for a paper, long defunct, called the National Observer. It was owned by the Wall Street Journal company. I went to South Carolina and interviewed James Dickey about his life as a Black Widow. He wasn't a pilot, but as a Black Widow airman. And that was a powerful thing because I was so enamored of this poem, the firebombing, and it was only decades later, 2 decades later, that I found out that Dickie was lying to my face, saying that he was the pilot. And this is complicated. I mean, David just spoke about Mort Mintz, who was one of the great old Washington Post investigative reporters. And I know so well what David's talking about. In David's book about his father facing the House of Un-American Activities and all that McCarthy witch hunt, Mort Mintz, way back at the University of Michigan. Tell that story.
No, I'm not going to because it's your book. Sorry.
But David's point is that David had to come up flat against the fact that somebody he admired intensely, Morton Mintz, had ratted out David's father. I mean, that's a cold water bath of a moment. And I wasn't related to James Dickey, but I was a friend of Christopher Dickey, who was a colleague of ours at the Washington Post. So all of this, so there's a whole chapter called Of James Dickey and My Father, and it's about parables and lies.
On the other hand, there's a delightful character in this book, Ray Rudkin, who you describe as the last living member of your father's unit, the 459th, a Wisconsin farm boy, no less.
From Sparta, Wisconsin, yeah.
From Sparta, Wisconsin. What was that experience like, getting to know Ray?
David, you keep asking the great questions, and I keep making the too long answers. What are the actuarial chances that someone would be alive from the 549th Night Fighter Squadron? My father was born in 1918. He'd be 106 tonight. I was going down the list. I had all the alumni rolls, just dialing I mean, when I started this book, there were 5 to 6 who were still alive. The only pilot who was still alive was Raymond Rudkin of East Sacramento, California. He was 96. And you would think a 96-year-old man, you wouldn't get anything out of him. The memory was like that. The neurons were firing. This was in the pitch of COVID, and I couldn't go out. My doctor would not let me go out for 9 months. So every month I would call Ray Rudkin on the phone, hoping, praying he'd be alive. He picked it up. The first time I got him on the phone, I said, "Is this Raymond Rudkin?" He said, "You flew in the 549?" He said, "Yep, that's me. I flew her. I'm sitting out here in the garage clipping my fingernails." And he said about 1.5 feet away from me is an old trunk full of photographs and documents and memorabilia and medals. He said, "Maybe you'd like to see that."
I know that feeling.
Yeah, I know you know that feeling. There are these amazing moments in journalism that none of us can explain. David has experienced it 1,000 times. If I said he writes 2 to 1, so let's say I've experienced it 500 times, David has experienced it 1,500 or 1,000. Here is the phenomenon, which I cannot explain. It's the phenomenon of luck based on desire. You almost will it into happening. You want it to happen so bad that it almost does. I mean, we've just experienced this. Jung called it the phenomenon of synchronicity, luck based on desire. But so many times I have found that experience. So he kept alive for the next 9 months. I got the permission to go from the dock. I'm on the next plane. I drive from San Francisco, and there he is. And we had 2.5 days in his living room. I was always afraid I was tiring him out, and his son, who takes care of him. So I'd stay a couple of hours. I'd go away. I'd come back. And without putting too much of a spin on this, here is the end of the story. Yes, I wrote a whole chapter called The Last Living Airman of the 549th, because he literally was. Now, none is alive. He died a few months after I was there. And he went fast. He just was coming out of his room and he died of a stroke. He told me when I first was in his house, he said, he said, I still have my driver's license. He said, he said, after we're done talking today, I could drive us out for a hot dog. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go with him.
No thanks.
I mean, my father was flying airplanes. He had a long commercial aircraft for Eastern Airlines career, 30 years. I was unafraid to go up with him when he was deep into his 70s. I mean, he was a man, when I squint and think about it, his whole life was about flying. And it makes me sad to say in some ways, but I think he was happiest when he was up there in his wild blue yonder.
Paul, you were still a toddler when he came home from the war, right? And he came home with not just surviving, but with some baggage that lasted for the rest of his life and helped shape yours. They didn't call it PTSD then.
No, they didn't call it PTSD. I think it took him 10 years to exorcise the demons that were inside him. 2 days ago, the Wall Street Journal, in its weekend edition, ran a pretty large review. And at the top of the review, in the print section, they reprinted a quote that I had put in the book from Michael Hare, who wrote Dispatches, which is, in my opinion, the great book about Vietnam. And the Wall Street Journal ran this quote that I had lifted out and put in my book. And here is the quote. Is it possible they were there and not haunted? No, not possible. So my father came home without visible scars, but the psychic scars were there, and I think it took him 10 years to exorcise them. And I didn't understand it for the longest time. My older brother and I essentially were trying to outrun his wrath. But I think if I've come to any kind of conclusions, it is that, well, I say very early in the book that this part of their lives, when he goes to Iwo Jima at age 25, a boy off a Kentucky farm, and my mother, 19, she was 21 by then, but 19 when they married, with 2 babies on her hips. This was the best part of their lives. This was, you know, like that movie, the best part of our lives. Whatever else I might say about their long struggle, this part of their lives seemed absolutely, to me, heroic and absolutely good. And I don't think that I could have possibly have done what he did at age 25. And I think he was scared out of his skull the entire time he was over there.
I think your mic is going out. Sorry.
How are we doing now? Whatever you missed hearing me say wasn't worth a damn. Wasn't worth anything anyway.
You say it took him 10 years to work his way through that, but the relationship was off and on or difficult for many years after that, right?
You know, I knew my father for 60 years. That's a long time. He was, you know, I knew him for 59 years. I can squint right now, and sometimes he seems to me almost as shimmery and gauzy as a half-remembered dream. And I think that one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was to try to feel his fleshiness again. But it was like all 50s fathers. Well, I'm broad stroking generalizing, but so many 50s fathers, he was distant. He was doing his job. And he did it extremely well, as best I know. He rose to captain for Eastern Airlines. But it was my mother. You know, the father is the eagle and the mother owns the heart. It was my mother who was there, who was the anchor. But late in his life, my father and I really came back together. We took a driving trip to Kitty Hawk and walked the sands where Wilbur and Orville flew December day in 1903. We went on several other trips together, and I think of those with a lot of deep fondness.
You know, for all of the whatever complications of your relationship with your father, I came out of the book feeling that deep admiration and love that you had for him. So I think that's the way most readers will come out of it in the end, very much so.
I wanted the book to be a tribute, but I didn't want to spare the hard stuff. You know, I think sometimes we greatly underestimate our parents. I think they can stand the truth about themselves. A conversation is always a kite in the wind, and you don't quite know where you're going or what you're going to say. But our son John wrote a book last year, Life on Delay, Making Peace with a Stutter. And there are very hard truths in that book. But I think his parents were able to stand the truths about their lives. So
We're going to take some questions from the audience over here. I'm going to ask one last question first, but please line up there if you have a question. Paul, when I finished my book about my father, I thought that, you know, that I still loved my father, and I thought I was writing about it to try to understand him, but I came away feeling that it really helped me understand myself in a deeper way as well. I'm wondering if you had that similar experience with this.
Yeah. I keep wondering, I mean, you suggested the kind of bookending effect. I wrote a reported memoir, Seminary of Search, and I've written this book, which in some ways feels more personal. It's about my father, but it's about me as well. It's about my extended family as well. I sometimes feel I should quit while I'm ahead and not try to write anything else.
Don't. I'm speaking for the audience.
Well, what David is not. David is deep into his next. He's working hard to triple me up, not double me up. Yes, ma'am.
So my question is, was your father in combat in this plane?
Yes, he was. He had several close calls. The main mission was to do, it was defensive in nature, was to do nightly, they called them CAPs, Combat Air Patrol, to patrol the island and to make it from the last remnants of invading planes that might come from Japan. But he went on intruder missions. He went on intruder missions to nearby Japanese-controlled islands, and there is a chapter about the night he got caught in the searchlights. If that night on the ground, 6 days after he arrived, and maybe his life got saved by a distance of 30 yards, that was not his most terrifying moment. His most terrifying moment was when the intelligence officer said, "You're going up to Iwo Jima tonight," which is 150 miles north of Iwo, "and you're going to bomb and strafe. And don't worry, because the searchlights are not effective." And he got caught in the searchlights, and the ack-ack is going off everywhere. And it was amazing he didn't take a direct hit and get blown to smithereens. Yes, he flew these intruder missions.
I should say that my father was at the Battle of the Bulge. He was 20. He was a son of immigrants, came from a small, gritty little mill town in Massachusetts. That was the worst battle We had the most losses in Europe in the Battle of the Bulge. He was in the infantry at the bottom of the heap. When we asked, he never talked about it. When we asked him about it, he got a Bronze Star. When we asked him about it, he said everybody got one.
Would you just stay there for just a second?
Sure.
It seems to me that often in these events, the most powerful questions come from the audience. My father only talked about the war 4 or 5 or 6 times in his life. There was a part of me that longed to hear it, and there was a part of me that did not want to hear it. That's a common experience that they did not talk about it. But I want to say one more thing. I think one of my father's disinclinations to talk about it was because he knew what had gone on there in the taking of Iwo Jima by the Marines. This little, as I called it, scrap of sulfurous sand, which was 4 miles long and 8 miles long and 4 miles at its widest. That in the whole Pacific War, that was the costliest and dirtiest and bloodliest sea. My dad knew what the Marines died and paid for. At the end of the first day, there were 2,400 casualties. Right. It's the only battle in World War II in which the Americans suffered more casualties than the Japanese. There were actually more Japanese deaths, but in terms of casualties, of woundings. So I've often wondered what my father thought when he arrived in this convoy 3 weeks after the island had been taken, and he circled the island, and the half-broken ships would have still been listing in the sand. They would have cleaned away the bodies by then. The great writer William Manchester, in a book called Goodbye Darkness, said that the descriptions of the men and their mangled bodies just beggared the imagination. Heads 20 feet from the torsos, et cetera, et cetera. I think my father understood what the people on the ground had to do to quote, secure that island. That was one of his disinclinations, because he often said to me, and I quoted in this book, well, Paul, I didn't really do that much in the war. And my comeback was, but you were there, Dad. And he would say, yes, I suppose that's so. Once I began to get the documents and begin to see about these intruder missions and other things, he did some very brave, heroic stuff. And it's no wonder, it seems to me, that he came home with these deep scars. And again, I reference Michael Hare. Is it possible they were there and not haunted? No, not possible. So I have deepest respect for your father, who came home and never wanted to talk about it.
I should say one more thing. I read the article that came before this book.
Yes,
I forget where it was published. I think it's a guy thing. Men and their fathers, as opposed to girls and their fathers.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Well, for me, I would kind of disagree with that because my father...
Please come up.
Oh, my father...
And maybe raise the microphone so everybody can hear you.
Tall. Because my father, who died 3 years ago at the age of 96, he was a first-generation Italian-American. You know what side Italy was on during World War II. Anyway, he was a Marine. He was on Iwo Jima. His division was the first to land on Green Beach. He crossed the island within 4 hours and was on the other side of Mount Suribachi. 4 days later, they saw the flag raise. They thought the war was over. They thought they had won. 67% fatality out of his unit. He lasted 12 to 14 days, made it up to airfield number 2, which is probably where your dad had.
Well, my father flew out of South Field, but you're talking about Central Field, yes.
Yeah.
That was airfield number 2, Montoya number 2.
And he got hit. So they transported him off and they amputated his right arm. But he survived. And I think part of I didn't know how deep you went into the research, because I had been told that was it the Navy? Because you had mentioned your father flew these planes under the Army. And
Army
I
Air
had
Corps.
been told, of course, they didn't tell my dad or the other poor guys that were on the ships heading there until they were heading there. This is where they were going. But that they were supposed to be, there were planes, quote, softening up the island before they were to land. And that the commanders wanted the airstrikes to continue much longer than the big fellas said. And I often wonder if they had listened to that, if there would have been less American casualties.
I am not any kind of big authority on World War II, much less on Iwo Jima. I did read my head off, but there still, to this day, would be fierce arguments whether the taking of Iwo Jima was remotely worth the loss of life that went on there. Thank you for that question.
Yeah.
You know, I just, on my peripheral vision, I saw my old friend David Finkel here. Talk about coincidence and strangeness. David and I discovered, do I have this right? Your father-in-law was in the 548th Night Fighter Squadron. Your dad. Yeah, they would have all trained at the place where I was born, at Hammer Field in Fresno, California. James Dickey trained at Hammer Field in Fresno. All the night fighter squadrons, all the P-61 pilots, all trained at Hammer Field. So, David, and what is your first name? Her father and David's father-in-law was in the 548th, just one squadron below my father's, and on Iwo Jima, and their planes were parked just down the runway. I've studied all the maps, just down the runway from where the 549th guys. So it's certainly a possibility if that they knew each other or at least ran into each other in some way. And here comes the most important question of all from Jackson Palmer Hendrickson. What is he going to say?
What advice would you have for a young writer?
All right, another generation of writers.
You know, when I introduced Jackson, this is true. We started, I said, we should write a little story together. And he said, how about Little Parrot? And I said, okay. And so our first one was Little Parrot Goes to the Pumpkin Patch. And I'm typing and he's dictating. And then when we got it done, we wanted to put our bylines on there. And he said, my name first. I have all the ideas. He said, my name goes first. And so I was reading some of it back to him. And I said, I'm going to answer your question in a minute, old buddy boy. So I'm reading some of it back to him. And it's true. He had the ideas. The little parrot is going through the pumpkin patch. And I'm reading some of it back to him. And I said, the line was something about, Seal and I laugh about this video all the time because she made the video. And so the little parrot went back to the patch. And Jackson goes, not the patch, the pumpkin patch. So what advice do I have for a young writer? Twofold, old buddy. And you're already along the way of this. Read. The first thing is read. Read all the stories that you can get, because reading helps you begin later to understand the finding of your own voice. The second, Jackson, and you've already done a little of this, is you got to work at it almost all the time. Here's my theory about writing. It's 98% perspiration, 2% inspiration. It's seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. I have to brag on Jackson. This week, he did a thing at his school about Sir Isaac Newton, and he memorized what Isaac Newton did. And I said, how did you get all that information? You researched it on the internet, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Jackson. You need to raise the microphone again.
Thank you very much for a wonderful evening, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I read the Wall Street Journal review, and it talked a little bit about the challenges that you had researching the book and all the records that you had to go looking for. I wonder, could you talk a little bit more about the challenges you did run into with records and trying to, I mean, you had that one lucky break with the pilot, but just a little more background.
A strange thing happened to me in the researching of this book. It was, so much of it took place during COVID. This is the luckiest archival break I've ever had in 50 years of writing books. The Air Force Historical Research Agency is located in Montgomery, Alabama at Maxwell Air Force Base. I couldn't go down there, and I knew they had many, many records from the 549th. I couldn't go down there, again, for the same reason I couldn't go to California to talk to Ray Rudkin, not immediately. But of course, I'm working on the book and working on the book. I kept calling the Air Force Historical Research. Nobody even picked it. It just rang and rang. It wasn't even a recorded message. And 4 months after I was making these almost weekly calls, a couple times a week, phone picks up, and a voice. In the book, I don't identify this as a male or a female voice. A voice picked up and said, can I help you? And I'm like flabbergasted. I said, I've been trying to get a hold of you folks for so long. And I'm writing a book about my father in the 549th. And the voice said, yes, we're just recently back to work. We don't have that much work to do. Maybe I can help you. Do you have any reference numbers? Do you have any hits? Before the end of that day, that was like 4 o'clock on a Friday or something. By 5 o'clock, comes to me through DOD Safe Drop, Department of Defense Safe Drop, about 2,000 pages. I went from nothing to 2,000 pages. This person who asked me not to identify him or her took my project on as a personal crusade. And we just discovered things together. And I was looking for a particular mission report, the mission report that had to do with the night my dad got caught in the searchlights. We couldn't find that mission report. And we looked and looked and looked. And all of a sudden, one day, the phone rang, and the person from Montgomery, won't say male or female, because this person said, look, I've gone to extra lengths to help you. This person was working on the weekends to help me. We, to this day, have never even met. And why this person took the cause upon himself, herself, to help me, I can't really say. But the voice said on the phone, you've got, whatever you're doing, so I need you to stop right now and get on your computer. I found it. She found this particular mission report of when he got caught in the searchlights. And that became part of the linchpin. I mean, again, I don't know, this phenomenon of luck often happens in journalism, and I can't explain it. But yeah, the book goes forward on a lot of archival research, but the book goes forward on trying to exhume the truths that were so long buried in my own heart about my relationship with my father, which, you know, my grandchildren are here tonight, and I'm trying to more softly speak of this, but it was a difficult relationship. And I decided that in for a dime, in for a dollar, as Ben Bradley used to say at the Washington Post. If you're going to write it, if you have to be able to tell the glory with the hard stuff. But I hope that at the end of it, it comes out as a tribute, as a loving tribute. I can remember the moment my father died in this hospice room in Florida with this absurd wallpaper and the eradicable scent of urine coming up out of the woodwork. In that moment, my father was showing me how to die. This difficult, severe man who for maybe 10 years was exorcising his demons and taking it out on his family. He was also showing me things about honoring an obligation. The night fighter died in the dark. He died in the middle of the night. Thank you, sir. Eric Carroll. Oh, my. Do we have time?
We can take one
This is. I was just mentioning David Finkel will come. Ladies and gentlemen, the man standing at the microphone. Ta-da-da! We do a drum roll. This is Eric Carroll. We went to Holy Trinity, Alabama, as boy seminarians in the fall of 1958. Eric, how many years ago is that? 8 from 14 is 6. 66 years ago?
Like 50, yeah.
66 years ago, because we're 80. I know how old you are. Eric and I were freshmen in high school going to the seminary together in 1958, and we met on a train. He came from California, I think. And we went to Holy Trinity, Alabama. And all these years we've stayed in touch. We have a little circle of ex-seminarians that we get on Zoom with each other. Eric, how are you tonight, buddy?
Good. I didn't expect
Raise that microphone.
Yeah. Many thanks for telling this story, because I don't think, at least the veterans I know, are not telling these stories, and they, at least not in the public forum. Personally, maybe. But they, I think what I'm seeing, and I look forward to reading your book now, is that the children of these veterans, who are now 80, are beginning to tell these stories. So I look forward to yours as maybe one of the first one I have the chance to read. I do have a question for you, so I won't let you off the hook.
But Eric, you were so modest. Because I think I know the guy's biography a bit. Your father was a service guy. Tell them about that.
Well, he was in intelligence, so he couldn't tell me anything.
But you grew up a kind of a military brat, right?
Oh yeah. I heard stories about he was behind the bamboo curtain in China. He was also behind the whatever you call it in Germany, and they didn't discover it until they had a beer at a local beer house, and they got their change in aluminum coins, and that said, "Whoops, you're in East Germany." So they had to surreptitiously get back across the border, because he was an intelligence officer, so he was a good target. Anyway, so I don't know many stories, but that's a couple of them. My question to you is, in your research, did you come across any more surprises? Because that's always what I'm finding in telling these stories. We're discovering much more.
I'll tell you one quickly. Just one that just popped into my mind. It's getting very near the end of the war. You know this. You know that we dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and 6 days later on Nagasaki, and that then ended the war. But they were thinking, the brass, of sending the Black Widow, the P-61 night fighters, from Tokyo, from Iwo Jima to Tokyo. That's 760 miles. That would be 1,500 miles round trip to bomb Tokyo. That airplane was not equipped for that. It was not that kind of an airplane. It wasn't a B-17 that could make these long haul ranges. So my father would have been picked to go. He was either the second or the third ranking flyer in the squadron. No question he would have gone. And then the war ended and he didn't have to go. I never knew a thing about that. I never knew the specifics of this suicide raid 6 days after he landed on the island. There is a horrific photograph in the book of Japanese bodies lying in a pit that the Marines came in with their flamethrowers and killed. The 600 Japanese came out of the caves and came sweeping through these squadron areas. My father's squadron was right in the middle of it. In daylight, unless my father had a bandana tied around him, he could not have missed looking into that pit and seeing these Japanese bodies, which were later a bulldozer came in and bulldozed them. I mean, it was just so. We talk about, is it possible they were there and not haunted? No, not possible. He carried that picture. I title that chapter "Clear Pictures." He carried that picture with him in his head for the rest of his life, and I knew something about a Japanese raid, but I never knew anything remotely close to that kind of horrific image he would have. So there were all these kinds of discoveries in the book, which made me understand his torment so much better. And there are other stories like that, but that's enough.
Yes, if he had gone on a bombing mission to Tokyo, it was a suicide mission.
Yeah.
Billy Mitchell tried it before then with a B-25. They were able to firebomb Tokyo, and a few made it to China because they didn't have fuel to make it back. But it was a suicide mission.
They wouldn't have even had the fuel to get all the way back.
Right. Thank you. I'm sure there's more surprises.
The one thing that's not a surprise is that it's a brilliant book. And Paul, there's one other quote about luck, which I often use, which is from Branch Rickey. Luck is the residue of design. So all of the luck that came your way in researching this book is because of your hard work, and we all thank you for it. Thank you.